I was really excited to bring Pamela here because Pamela is one of the newer members of the Oversight Board, newer in the sense that there was an initial cohort and three members were brought on in 2022. And so when it came time to decide, okay, we're going to go to RightsCon. This is going to be one of the most important moments for the Oversight Board to connect with organizations and raise awareness, but also raise awareness kind of a two-way street in terms of what the board does, but then also everything that you've accomplished so far here. And so when, I'm going to be kind of blowing a little bit of smoke, but I really do think you're one of the board members who brings a real genuine curiosity along with expertise into this space. And I'm going to just kind of start off to give people a sense of who you are and your own values and what really brought you to the board in the first place. So I'd love to know a little bit more on that.
Well, thank you, Ali, and it's wonderful to be with you guys. And I'm sorry that you're going to see me with notes. But even though I speak English well, I know, I'm not used to speaking English when I'm talking about work-related things. My native language is Spanish, so I always have to keep notes to remember the words. And really, I know it's not something I convey that easily, but I promise it's complicated for me in English. So let me tell you a bit. I come from working in the Mexico City Human Rights Commission for like about 10 years. Then I was one of the 11 electoral counselors in the Electoral Institute in Mexico, which is a huge institution in Mexico. It's an institution that has everything to do with elections. But when I say everything, it's not only organizing physically the elections, it's doing everything around the elections, guaranteeing funding of the elections and reviewing the funds of the elections, guaranteeing that content is moderated for the elections, that everybody complies with the rules of the elections. And in a country where we put oversights and controls over everything regarding the elections because we don't trust each other at all. So I worked there for like another 10 years, and now I'm in the Oversight Board. So basically, to me, it has to do very much with rights of people. How can we protect and guarantee people's rights and people's liberties in the best way possible? And I've had the wonderful opportunity to work to build and to uphold and strengthen institutions that do precisely that. And that is what brought me to think of the board, because the world has changed. We always thought of rights being something that was only protected by states because our rights were against the states. But suddenly we have private entities that wield way more power than many governments and that can control what we see, what we hear, what we know, what we do, with a very differential impact in different countries. And we have to face up to that challenge. And I don't think the Oversight Board is the only way to go around it, or an institution or a body as the Oversight Board, an independent body overseeing a private entity. Because even though Meta created the Oversight Board, it created it with guarantees of independence for it to actually be able to work, for it to actually be able to complete its duties of making binding decisions on very complex and hopefully emblematic issues in a way that is not fragmented territorially. That would be what happens when you have governments overseeing a social media company. And even though there's limitations, of course, in the board scope, and that's something that we have to do, I think the fact that the board is an independent body comprised of diverse members that come from all over the world, from different regions, from different backgrounds, from different professional and basic normal backgrounds, it gives us the possibility to see things in a different way and to see them outside the interests of the company. It makes us understand, because of our own backgrounds sometimes, the importance of stakeholder engagement, of hearing those who are actually experts in some things, those who know way much more than any of us in specific topics, as to be able to not only make the best decisions when they're binding decisions, but also for these decisions to come with recommendations that will be implementable, that will actually have the desired effect and not unintended consequences, which is something that can happen very easily when we're talking about social media. I mean, first, engineers will understand this way better than I do, because it's not only about making the right decision. It's what happens when this decision goes into the social media ecosystem, with the scale, with the speed, with the reach that you have of information circulating. And it's these ideas that made me see that the oversight board is a complementary mechanism that I think can be useful to making specifically Meta, but platforms more accountable, to make them more congruent, to make them more consistent, for them to treat users more fairly. Or we know there will always be mistakes when we're moderating content at scale, when we're talking about content moderation at scale, but platforms do have a responsibility, and especially such huge platforms as Meta platforms, Facebook, Instagram, have a responsibility to take measures to address the problems that we all see coming. Right now, they were talking about the Brazilian elections. There was a lot of work done for the Brazilian elections, but it's true that we all saw it coming. All of us who knew a little bit about elections, we saw coming what happened. But not only did we see coming something that was going to be terrible, we saw exactly what happened coming. We saw the polarization growing. We saw violence growing. What happened in January 8th was, we didn't know what was going to happen January 8th. Could have happened the 1st, could have happened a week before, or maybe 2 weeks after. But it was something that you saw coming, and that is something that platforms have to get in front of to act responsibly. And an independent oversight mechanism intends to do that. Intends to do that in ways that can be useful to users specifically.
Yeah, I think you've given the board a big remit too, and I think one of the things that I'm also sort of curious about, and I think others are curious about as well, is the difference from being outside of the oversight board and then coming in. And you've been with the board for just over a year now. What's different from maybe what you perceived before? What's different actually doing this work?
Well, the first difference is the responsibility. It's much easier just complaining about platforms on the outside than when you're actually in a decision-making place where you can tell the company to make binding decisions that have to do with one content, but that have differential impacts, and when you make policy recommendations. And I'm one of the 3 Latin American members of the board, and I think that brings me even greater responsibility, not only for my region, but it's a responsibility for all those regions that are most forgotten, that are most neglected by the companies, and that I'm sorry to say that all these layoffs are the ones that are going to be more impacted by all the measures that are being taken, or all the unintended consequences that will come out of all these layouts. And I think since joining the board, it's clearer to me the need that a social media company has to have an independent oversight. There are things that a company, you guys explained it very well before. You might have a very good intention. There might be like the right answer. The problem is the company has interests. Different teams in a company have interests. That doesn't mean that everybody that works in the company is perverse and they don't want to do anything. But there are incentives for each and every one of the different teams. And when you're able to actually see from the outside, without the economic interest, the commercial interest in mind, any other interests that the company might have, but when you're looking at is the protection of users, you see things with a different perspective. And I think that's something that the oversight board brings to the company. And I'm going to put it in like 3 examples. One is if people are to trust social media platforms, they have to think that there's rules that apply to them, that they apply fairly, that they apply consistently, at least generally. And that is why I think that one of the most important decisions that the board is taking up to now is the cross-check PAO, the cross-check policy advisory opinion that has to do with the cross-check, this system that Meta has that establishes additional like layers of review for potentially violating content, not to be removed from the outset, but until it has human review and different layers of human review. This means that content that can be potentially violating and that can have a very wide reach will remain on the platform waiting for the enhanced review. And when the board analyzed this, it found different failures in the way Meta was using the system. Failures that had to do with treating users fairly, that had to do with all the negative impact of content, violating content remaining on the platform, the lack of metrics, like core metrics, the lack of transparency for it to work. And the recommendations were, okay, you're going to have a system like this? Perfect. Protect that speech that has more importance for human rights than your business, the speech that is important for your business. Protect, take measures to mitigate and address the impacts that come from not removing content expeditiously or as expeditiously as you would with other users. Of course, bring way much more transparency onto the way that that it works. Second example, sorry, and I'm going to go faster with the other ones. Second example, social media companies have to think of one thing that usually those who protect our rights don't. I mean, governments. What law do you apply? That you have users all around the world with different cultures, with different languages, with different everything. What law do you apply? What rule? What regulation? In the board, we have found that even though if you saw our charter, it says that we have to see that Meta complies with its values and its standards and with human rights, international human rights standards. Well, we put international human rights standards basically on the top because that is the way to actually be able to find a more equitable solution for and a solution that actually people can trust in for the diversity, the global diversity that there is. And third, it's why in the board we find context to be so relevant. But when we think of context, we usually think of socio-political context or economical context. And of course, that is very relevant. If we think of a case we solved recently, the Iran case, where you have a country that there's enormous repression and social media plays a big role in that. It plays a big role for people to express themselves, for people to organize themselves, for people to enjoy anything close to a civic space. And we decided that there was a slogan in the protests that were just the recent protests. They used a slogan that was Marak Bar Khamenei. Marak Bar Khamenei, translated literally, means death to Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader. Death to a head of state is prohibited in Meta platforms. There's only one problem. That is the way they call for changing a regime. That is exactly how they call for the change of a regime. Death too is better understood for them as down with, because Khamenei is untouchable, basically. I mean, it's not because nobody would dare do something against him. There's literally no possibility. So we said, you have to take that context into account, what it means for them, and apply it. And Meta applied it really fast. I think it's one of the recommendations it's taken more swiftly and just permitted Marak Bar Khamenei being used. But you also have the digital context. And in the digital context, you have coordinated, authentic, or inauthentic behaviors, because platforms think a lot of this inauthentic behaviors. After like all the things, the Russia interference and all of that, it's like, okay, we're going to deal with coordinated inauthentic behavior. But what we have also is coordinated authentic behavior. People who, or very influential people who make campaigns that can distribute tons of misinformation or disinformation or whatever we call it. They can distribute incite violence. They can harass through these campaigns, and we can't only see content in isolation. We have to see it in these trends, in this ecosystem where it's spreading. We also have the cumulative impact that the repeated exposure to certain content can have on certain communities or certain regions. It is not the same to use a word in some countries than in others. For example, if you use we decided when we made one decision having to do with South Africa, where the most derogatory term you can use against a black person is kafir. And it doesn't have to do with one person having a bad intent of using kafir to really antagonize someone or hurt someone, but with the fact that if you permit certain words to continually expose that they are degrading, that they are discriminatory, that they incite violence, the impact and the effect that you will have on people is enormous. Then you have another context that has to do with rules that are apparently neutral or not problematic at least, but that can have like enormously differential impacts on people. The female nudity policy in Facebook. You see the female nudity policy? We might agree on many reasons why it's a very good policy, but then you have other groups, LGBTIQ plus groups. What happens to trans people? It's very complicated the way that they're treated in that policy. What happens to indigenous people who live with bare trunks and they try to dance with bare trunks? You have many problems that come around. And just to top it off, you have a different access to information depending on different countries. You don't have the same access to information in, for example, Europe or the US than you will have in Malaysia, that you will have in many countries in Latin America. And the impact that the platforms can have in those regions are way bigger. And it's where the companies invest the least resources. But that's precisely why an independent oversight will focus on those regions, on those problems, on those impacts. And I'm sorry.
No, I think you launched into.
I get excited when I talk about
a lot of the complexity, and I hope that really encourage folks to come and talk to us throughout the week and today, especially. I want to bring us into the conversation, since the whole premise that we have here today is really about digital citizen engagement and how the board does work with different stakeholders and organizations. And I've said this already, is that we're at RightsCon. We're with some of the most prominent digital rights activists worldwide. And they've been traveling this road for a long, long time and really paved the way for the board to exist. Mm-hmm. And so, how do you see the board being able to respectfully build on this and work together with the community that's represented here that also may not be able to be here physically, as here online? How can we continue to engage?
I think that one of the main strengths or the main weaknesses that an independent oversight mechanism can have has to do with stakeholder engagement. If you do if you outreach, if you talk to people who know more than you, if you recognize that you don't know everything, that there's people who have expertise that we can learn from each other in a two-way street, that is the best way to actually have an impact on the company. And I think something that the board has done correctly from the outset is the fact that it has engaged with stakeholders around the world, and it's trying to have a bigger outreach every time with stakeholders, because it is usually people who work on specific topics who will be able to tell you what problem you have. What is something that has to be addressed? You have digital rights organizations that'll tell you technically some problems that tech companies have. But you also have human rights organizations, for example, that will tell you the impacts of certain decisions on people on the ground. And you have other researchers or organizations that will tell you some context that should be taken into account for some decisions. And that helps the board decide which cases to take. It helps the board decide how to address the cases, which recommendations to make, because that's something that the board cannot do alone. And it opens public comments for every single decision after the case is chosen, because we find that public comments are necessary for us to actually inform ourselves. Yes, we are 23 board members that have diverse backgrounds, that come from different regions, but I'm from Mexico. I would not think that I know Ecuador or Costa Rica or Honduras better than people that come from Honduras, Ecuador, or Costa Rica. Probably will know it better than somebody who comes from Africa, because we're closer together. I mean, we have more of an identity. But when you actually talk to people who are on the ground and who know what's happening in the different countries, there is where you can learn. We are currently finishing a decision on Brazil, on the Brazilian election. And why did that come up? Because organizations started telling us, we have a problem here. We have to see how the Meta is dealing with the elections in Brazil. And we took that one. We took another case from Cambodia, which is also coming out soon. And it's how election spaces, either before or after, are being used to incite violence, for example, by political leaders. And this is something that we could not necessarily grasp if we don't have input from external stakeholders. We would not have understood the extent to which death to Khamenei was not a call to death, but was a call to change a regime if we had not received input from people in Iran. We would not have understood the cross-check system and the impacts, like technical impacts it has, had we not spoken with people who, with organizations who work on understanding that. We would have not understood the impacts of COVID policy, COVID misinformation policies, had we not taken like roundtables with different stakeholders around the world. Because it's not just about talking to many people, it's talking about to the right people in specific cases. And I think that's something the board has done and any independent mechanism would need to do if it actually wants to have an impact, because I think that is fundamental. And that's why I really appreciate being with all you guys today and this week.
Yeah, I actually no. We only have, I think, a couple of minutes left, and I think it's worth it to take some questions since you do have one. So I don't know if you get a microphone or I can bring this one down.
Hi, I'm Alan Kusuma. I'm from Indonesia. Previous to this, I worked for a non-profit organization in Indonesia called SafeNet, Southeast Asia Freedom of Expression Network. I've met Holly actually for a few times in Zoom meetings with the oversight board, so I'm very happy that I get to hear and meet you here. My question is, learning from what happened to Twitter, do you think what is the potential that oversight board can lose its connection with Facebook? I mean, the way this digital platform is governed is pretty much like they have a goodwill and we have a goodwill, right? But then when someone like break that goodwill, well, we can see how Ellen do the Twitter right now. So yeah, I just wonder how oversight board can sustain if there is policy changes in Facebook regarding the oversight board's policy or recommendation? Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. This is kind of touching on something we've been thinking about a lot, obviously, with the recent layoffs at Meta, and figured people would want to talk about this as well. So, Pamela, if you want to jump in, but I think the question is what do you do when companies are disinvesting in trust and safety, and we see these so many folks here that this is not just how you earn a living, but it's something that you champion, that you care about, that you are invested in and invested in these companies before. So do you want to talk a little bit about like where the board is with this?
I think that's something that Twitter gave a very vivid example of what happens when you literally stop investing in anything having to do with trust and safety. I mean, it was an example that you could see almost from one day to the next. I mean, it's something incredible because usually you see the impacts that certain decisions have over time. So you kind of start getting used to the first step by the time you get to the second step, by the time you get to the third step. So it's like a little more normalized, the changes that come through. But with Twitter, we saw it from one day to the next, literally. And I think that's something that social media companies have to learn from. Big social media companies have to learn from that. You might have disinvestments, you might have layoffs, but if you don't invest enough to keep a platform safe, it will have impacts on its users and it will have impacts on the way you work. And when I think of this, what worries me maybe the most is not, and of course, all users of Facebook and Instagram, but especially when we think of Global South, global majority. Global majority countries are considerably more impacted because if you think of Global North, Europe, you have DSA. DSA will make the companies invest money if they want it or they don't. But there's many other countries where you don't have the same incentives to invest. Meta has stayed committed up to now to the board. They just funded us last year for the next 3 years. And when they fund the board, it's an irrevocable trust so we can guarantee independence, etc. And I don't think anybody can guarantee what will happen in the future, but I think the probability of the board actually continuing its work or other initiatives as the board continuing its work with the differences that could be in platforms has to do with the possibility of actually having an impact on the users, on the ways platforms work, on mitigating or preventing unintended or unwanted effects. And when I think of unwanted effects, I'm thinking of people's unwanted effects, not necessarily the company's unwanted effects. But that is something that companies still have this responsibility, and every day more, states are looking for ways to hold companies accountable. And if these measures are not taken by the companies themselves, there is a very big risk that governments will come in. And I say there's a very big risk because if we think of DSA and looking for transparency measures and for accountability I'm all for that. But when we start seeing governments want to tell the platforms what to keep up and what to take down, then I start concerning. Because then I start thinking about the way authoritarian governments have been moving throughout the last years and how like the whole world is going a bit more authoritarian every single year. If we just look, for example, at the numbers of Freedom House. So platforms have to take that responsibility that many of them, Meta, for example, committed to with the UNGPs. And I don't think the role of civil society is doing what social media companies are not doing. But I think the role that such a media company has played and should play is not social media, that civil society or organizations have played and should play is demanding, is generating like context of demand for the platforms, because it's really been when there are scandals that we have had steps forward, like very important steps forward. And I think we should like try to avoid, would like to go before the scandal as much as possible.
Yeah. All right. Well, we are out of time to be on stage, but we're here. We're here to talk to you all. So we'll come down and mingle. I don't know if this is the moment where there's a break or if we've just got to